Las Vegas has a way of convincing people that time doesn't matter. Night bleeds into morning without apology. Neon replaces sunlight, and memory becomes optional. In 1996, the city was louder than it had ever been, flush with tourists, cash, and confidence. The Strip pulsed like a living thing, every hotel promising escape, anonymity, reinvention. People arrived carrying suitcases and expectations, and most of them left with nothing more than stories. Some, however, didn't leave at all. That night began like hundreds of others before it. A commercial jet descended through the desert darkness, its lights blinking steadily as it approached McCarran International Airport. Inside the cabin, passengers stirred from half-sleep, gathering belongings, already thinking ahead to hotel rooms, casinos, or connecting flights. For 3 flight attendants on board, Las Vegas was not a destination. It was a pause, a layover, a brief window of rest between skies. They had done this countless times before. Their uniforms were crisp but creased from hours of work. Their smiles were professional but tired. They moved with the quiet coordination that comes from shared routines. One checking paperwork, another securing the galley, the third glancing down the aisle to make sure no one was left behind. When the plane finally parked at the gate, they stepped off together, blending into the stream of airport staff and travelers who barely noticed them. To the city, they were interchangeable. To each other, they were familiar, grounding, safe. Outside, Las Vegas waited. The air was warm even at night, carrying the faint smell of asphalt and cigarette smoke. Shuttle buses lined the curb, engines idling, drivers calling out hotel names with mechanical repetition. The women boarded one without thinking twice. The hotel had been assigned by the airline, a reputable place, well-known, centrally located. Nothing about it raised concern. If anything, it offered relief. Clean beds, blackout curtains, silence behind thick doors. As the shuttle pulled away, the Strip unfolded around them. Towers of glass and steel rose against the dark sky, glowing in impossible colors. Billboards promised desire, luck, transformation. The city didn't whisper, it shouted. Yet inside the bus, the mood was subdued. Someone joked about grabbing room service. Someone else mentioned calling home before sleeping. Small talk, the kind that feels insignificant until it becomes the last of its kind. They arrived at the hotel just after midnight. The lobby was vast and polished, designed to impress and overwhelm. Marble floors reflected chandeliers that never dimmed. The air was cool, conditioned, detached from the desert outside. Guests drifted through with drinks in hand, laughter echoing faintly, chips clinking somewhere deeper inside the building. The front desk staff worked efficiently, barely looking up as IDs were presented and keys were issued. Names were typed, numbers assigned, paperwork completed. This was a place built on transactions, not connections. Security cameras watched from corners, their red lights blinking steadily. Elevators opened and closed with soft chimes. The women stood together as they waited, suitcases at their feet, shoulders finally relaxing now that the workday was over. One of them leaned back against the wall, eyes closed for a moment. Another checked her watch, calculating how many hours of sleep she might get before pickup in the morning. The third adjusted her grip on her bag, scanning the lobby out of habit rather than fear. Nothing happened. No argument. No strange encounter. No moment that would later be identified as the turning point. When the elevator doors opened, they stepped inside together. The doors slid shut. The car ascended smoothly, numbers lighting up one by one. Somewhere between floors, conversation faded into comfortable silence. That elevator ride would become the last confirmed moment anyone saw them. Las Vegas, meanwhile, kept breathing. Slot machines rang. Dice rolled. Drinks were poured. In hotel rooms all around them, people celebrated wins, losses, anniversaries, affairs. Music thumped faintly through walls. Somewhere nearby, another elevator opened. Another door closed. The city absorbed the night without distinction. In their assigned rooms, beds waited untouched. Curtains hung heavy and dark. Telephones sat silent. Uniforms were never laid out for the morning. Alarm clocks were never set. And yet at that hour, no one noticed. Because in Las Vegas, silence is not unusual. Guests sleep through mornings. People miss checkout times. Schedules bend. Assumptions fill the gaps. The absence of three women, even three flight attendants with precise routines, did not register as danger. Not yet. The city had no reason to panic. It never does. Outside, the lights burned on relentlessly, refusing darkness its natural place. Time passed unnoticed. Midnight slipped into early morning. Somewhere far above the strip, airplanes continued to arrive and depart, carrying crews who trusted that the ground beneath them was solid, that the places assigned for rest were safe. By the time the sun began to rise over the desert, casting pale light behind the glittering skyline, something irreversible had already occurred. But the city did not acknowledge it. The hotel did not react. The world went on as it always had. This is how disappearances often begin, not with screams or violence, but with routine, with trust, with a place that promises comfort and delivers quiet instead. Three women walked into a hotel in Las Vegas, believing they would sleep, wake, and leave. The city accepted them without resistance. It would not give them back so easily. Before they became a mystery, before their names were reduced to headlines and case files, they were simply three women moving through the narrow space between responsibility and exhaustion. Flight attendants learned early how to live in fragments, hours broken by turbulence, friendships formed in airports, sleep taken wherever it fits. Their lives are measured not in days, but in routes. And yet, within that constant motion, each of them had built a quiet sense of self. The oldest of the three had been flying the longest. She treated the job not as an adventure, but as a craft. Her uniform was always immaculate, her hair secured just right, her movements economical and calm. She had a way of making passengers feel looked after without ever crossing into familiarity. Among the crew, she was a steady one, the person others deferred to when something went wrong. At home, she was the organizer, the one who remembered birthdays and kept family traditions alive even while spending holidays at 30,000 feet. Flying had given her independence, but it had also taught her control. She liked knowing what to expect. She liked routines. Las Vegas, to her, was just another stop on the map. The second woman carried a different energy. She was younger, restless in a way that never fully settled. She loved the job for the access it gave her, to places, to people, to the feeling that life was wider than the town she grew up in. She talked often about change, about maybe leaving the airline one day, about doing something creative, something that felt more like hers. On flights, she was warm and open, quick to laugh, the kind of person passengers remembered. Off duty, she filled notebooks with half-formed plans and ideas, always imagining what might come next. That night in Las Vegas, she joked about the city, about how it felt unreal, like a stage set. She had no idea how close that comparison would come to the truth. The third woman was the quietest. She observed more than she spoke, listening carefully, storing details others missed. To passengers, she seemed reserved, professional to the point of distance. To her colleagues, she revealed herself slowly, dry humor, thoughtful questions, surprising tenderness beneath her composure. She valued privacy. Her life outside work was carefully guarded, shared only in fragments. She had chosen this career not for escape, but for balance. The sky gave her space. The ground gave her roots. Las Vegas was neither temptation nor threat to her. It was simply where she would sleep that night. Together, they formed the kind of temporary bond common among flight crews. Intense, efficient, and strangely intimate. You learn a lot about someone when you work in confined spaces, when you rely on each other for safety, when you manage other people's fears while suppressing your own fatigue. They knew each other's tells, who needed quiet after landing, who liked to call home immediately, who would forget to eat if no one reminded her. On the flight into Las Vegas, nothing felt unusual. The passengers were typical for the route. Tourists eager to arrive, business travelers already planning their return. The crew performed their duties with practiced ease. When turbulence rattled the cabin briefly, one of them caught another's eye and smiled, a silent reassurance exchanged without words. By the time the wheels touched down, the flight had blended seamlessly into memory, another completed task. After landing, they moved to the airport together, still in work mode but loosening at the edges. Someone mentioned how late it was. Someone else noted how bright everything looked. Even at that hour, their conversation drifted easily, unburdened by urgency. They were thinking about showers, about sleep, about the quiet relief that comes when responsibility finally lifts. Each of them made small, ordinary choices that night. One decided she would call her sister in the morning, instead of waking her so late. Another planned to grab breakfast downstairs before pickup. The third mentally reviewed her schedule for the rest of the week, already shifting her focus forward. None of them sensed danger. None of them felt watched. This is what makes their disappearance so unsettling. There was no visible fracture in their lives, no dramatic tension, no secret unraveling at the surface. They were not running from anything. They were not chasing something reckless. They were doing what they had done dozens of times before, trusting the systems designed to support them. Their families would later replay these details endlessly, conversations remembered in sharper clarity than they ever held at the time. A tone of voice on the phone, a passing comment about being tired, a laugh that would never be heard again. Each memory would become evidence, weighed and reweighed, searching for meaning that simply wasn't there. At the hotel, as they waited for the elevator, they stood close together without realizing it. Proximity had become second nature. In a job where safety depends on awareness, companionship becomes a kind of shield. They had learned to move as a unit, to look out for one another instinctively. That night, the habit followed them inside. They entered the elevator with the quiet choreography of people who had done this before. Bags shifted, buttons pressed, a shared exhale as the doors closed. It was a moment so ordinary that it barely existed, except that it would later become sacred, frozen in time, dissected, returned to again and again. When investigators would eventually ask who these women were, the answers would come in fragments. Co-workers describing professionalism, families describing warmth, friends describing ambition, restraint, humor. None of it would point to an ending. None of it would explain how three distinct lives could vanish in the same place, at the same time, without leaving a single mark. They were not defined by tragedy then. They were defined by movement, by trust, by the belief that the world beneath the wings was stable enough to rest upon. That belief had carried them across continents and time zones, through storms and sleepless nights. In Las Vegas, on that layover in 1996, they were still whole, still themselves, still unaware that they were standing at the edge of a story that would erase their ordinary lives and replace them with a question that would last nearly 3 decades. They stepped forward together, carrying nothing but what they needed for the night, and trusted that the morning would come. The hotel had been designed to impress first and explain nothing. From the outside, it rose confidently from the strip, a monument to money and movement, glass catching the glow of neon and reflecting it back brighter. Inside, it was a controlled environment, temperature regulated, lighting carefully chosen, every surface polished to suggest permanence. This was not just a place to sleep. It was a machine built to manage people in large numbers without ever truly knowing them. Hotels in Las Vegas are different from hotels anywhere else. They are not meant to feel personal. They are meant to feel limitless. Thousands of guests move through their corridors every day, most of them anonymous, most of them transient. Names matter only long enough to authorize a room key. After that, people become silhouettes, figures passing through hallways, entering elevators, disappearing behind doors. For the 3 flight attendants, the hotel was simply part of the job. Airlines chose accommodations based on contracts and convenience, not charm. This one met the requirements. Secure, reputable, close enough to the airport. To the crew, it offered what all layover hotels promised: rest without responsibility, the illusion of safety without the burden of familiarity. The lobby that night was alive but detached. Music played softly, engineered to soothe rather than entertain. Guests drifted in loose clusters, some energized by the night, others already worn down by it. The front desk staff moved with efficiency, eyes trained to handle transactions, not stories. The women approached, IDs ready, voices low, their presence barely interrupting the rhythm of check-ins and check-outs. Their information was entered into the system. Room numbers assigned, keys issued. The hotel acknowledged them in the only way it knew how, digitally, temporarily, without attachment. Security was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Cameras dotted the ceilings, their lenses fixed and unblinking. They recorded continuously. But recording did not mean watching. Footage would be stored, overwritten, archived, depending on policy and perceived importance. The promise of surveillance created comfort without guaranteeing protection. The architecture reinforced this sense of controlled anonymity. Corridors stretched long and identical, carpeted in patterns designed to disorient just enough that guests will rely on signage rather than memory. Elevators opened into hallways that looked like every other hallway. Doors were thick, heavy, meant to seal sound inside. Once closed, a room became a private world, invisible to those outside it. The women moved through these spaces without hesitation. Their familiarity with hotels made them confident. They had slept in hundreds like this one. Some nicer, some worse, most indistinguishable in retrospect. They knew the rhythms. Late-night noise fading by morning, early departures. Housekeeping carts rattling softly down the hall. As they waited for the elevator, they were surrounded by strangers who would never remember them. A couple arguing quietly. A man laughing into his phone. Someone dragging a suitcase with one broken wheel. All of them shared the same space for a moment, then drifted apart, their paths diverging permanently. When the elevator arrived, it swallowed them whole. Inside, the mirrors multiplied their reflections, creating the illusion of depth where there was none. Fluorescent lighting flattened faces, erased shadows. The doors closed with muted thud, sealing them into a vertical capsule that existed outside the flow of the lobby. For a few seconds, they were suspended between floors, between public and private. No one would later recall seeing them exit. This fact would become central to the mystery, but at the time, it meant nothing. Elevators in large hotels are constant. People step in and out all night long. Cameras, if present, capture fragments, partial angles, block views, timestamps without context. The absence of an image is not immediately alarming. It is simply another gap. Above, the floors waited in silence. The hotel rooms assigned to them were standard, neutral colors, generic artwork, furniture chosen for durability rather than personality. Beds were neatly made, sheets tight, pillows fluffed by hands that never expected to be part of a crime scene. Televisions faced beds. Phones sat untouched on bedside tables. Everything was in its place, waiting. Housekeeping would later report nothing unusual. No signs of struggle. No personal belongings disturbed. No mess. It was as if the rooms had never been entered at all. This was the hotel's greatest strength and its greatest danger. It absorbed absence as easily as presence. A room left unused for a night did not raise suspicion. Guests overslept. Plans changed. People left early. People checked in and never stayed. The system was built to accommodate unpredictability. Without question, staff worked in shifts, their awareness limited to assigned zones. A housekeeper might clean dozens of rooms without ever seeing a guest. Security might patrol hallways without knowing who was supposed to be there. Information lived in separate compartments, rarely overlapping unless forced to. In this environment, disappearance did not announce itself. It blended in. Overnight, the hotel continued to function perfectly. Elevators ran. Lights stayed on. Guests came and went. Some were within its walls. Something was wrong. But the structure itself offered no way to sense it. Buildings do not feel guilt. Systems do not panic. By morning, checkout time approached for some guests. Others slept through it. The front desk handled requests, complaints, and transactions with practice calm. No alert was triggered for 3 women who had not emerged from their rooms, because the hotel did not know they were missing. To the system, they were simply occupants who had not yet appeared. This is how spaces like this protect secrets, not through malice, but through design. When a place is built to handle thousands of people without friction, it also becomes capable of swallowing individuals whole. The very features meant to provide comfort privacy, discretion, scale become tools of erasure. For years, this hotel would stand unchanged in the public eye. Renovations would come and go. Management would shift. Walls would be repainted. Carpets replaced. Entire sections would be remodeled. And beneath those layers of renewal, the past would remain sealed, undisturbed, waiting. That night in 1996, as the city outside glowed endlessly, the hotel fulfilled its purpose. It offered silence. It offered separation. It offered a place where 3 women could disappear without sound, and no one noticed. Morning in Las Vegas arrives without ceremony. The sun rises over the desert, but the city barely acknowledges it. Curtains stay drawn. Lights remain on. Night workers trade places with day staff in quiet handoffs that blur the boundary between hours. Inside the hotel, the transition was seamless. Guests slept late. Others stumbled back to their rooms as dawn crept in, carrying the weight of a night spent chasing luck. For the 3 flight attendants, morning was supposed to be precise. Airline schedules are unforgiving. Pickup times are exact. Crews are expected to appear polished and ready regardless of how little rest they've had. Missing a report time is rare. Missing a flight without explanation is almost unheard of. This is why the first sign that something was wrong did not come from the hotel. It came from the airline at the designated hour. The shuttle arrived outside the hotel. Its engine idled. The driver checked his list. Names were there. Rooms were listed. He waited. Minutes passed. Inside the lobby, guests flowed past him, some checking out, others heading toward breakfast. He glanced at the elevators, then back at his watch. Delays happened. Crews overslept. Someone might call down to say they needed 5 more minutes. He waited longer. No call came. Back at the airport, the departure clock moved forward without them. Gate agents made quiet inquiries. Dispatch reached out to the hotel. A message was left at the front desk. Still, there was no sense of urgency, yet. In a city like Las Vegas, unpredictability was expected. Assumptions filled the space where concern might have grown. At the hotel, the front desk took the call and checked the system. 3 rooms, checked in the night before. No checkout recorded. No request logged. No red flags. The clerk attempted to call the rooms. The phones rang unanswered. This, too, was not unusual. Guests slept through calls all the time. Housekeeping had not yet serviced the rooms. Do not disturb signs were common, especially for airline crews trying to rest. There was no policy requiring staff to enter a room, simply because its occupants had not appeared. The morning continued. At the airline, the absence grew heavier. The flight could not wait. Replacement crew members were arranged. The missing attendants were officially marked as no-shows, a classification that felt wrong even as it was applied. Supervisors tried again to reach them. Personal phones went straight to voicemail. No one answered. This was when worry began to harden into something sharper. Attempts were made to trace their movements. Had they left early? Had they taken a different shuttle? Had they decided to explore the city instead of resting? Each question implied a choice, a voluntary deviation from routine. None of them fit the women's known habits, but without evidence, doubt crept in. By late morning, airline management contacted hotel security more firmly. A request was made to physically check the rooms. When staff finally entered, they found nothing out of place. Beds untouched, luggage absent, bathrooms unused. It looked less like someone had overslept and more like someone had never arrived. That realization shifted the tone. Security reviewed what they could. Key card records showed the rooms had been assigned, but no additional entries were logged after check-in. Elevators carried hundreds of guests overnight. Cameras showed fragmented activity. People moving, doors opening and closing, but no clear image of the women after the lobby. The absence of evidence was not immediately interpreted as evidence of absence. Instead, it created confusion. Without signs of forced entry or disturbance, the possibility of foul play seemed distant, almost inappropriate to suggest. Families were notified slowly, carefully. Calls were placed with cautious language. We're trying to locate them. There's been a delay. We don't have information yet. Those words landed like weight. Even as they attempted to soften the truth, relatives began calling hospitals jails, friends. Each unanswered question widened the gap between expectation and reality. Las Vegas, a city known for excess, suddenly felt barren. By afternoon, law enforcement was contacted. Officers arrived at the hotel, walking through the same polished lobby the women had passed through hours earlier. To them, it was just another missing persons call, stripped of urgency by the lack of immediate danger. Adults disappear all the time. Some return. Some don't. They asked routine questions. When were they last seen? Did they have conflicts? Were they under stress? Did they gamble? Did they drink? The questions carried assumptions, subtle and unavoidable, that responsibility might lie with the missing themselves. The hotel cooperated within limits. Access was granted to certain areas. Information was shared selectively. There was no lockdown, no public alert. Guests continued their stays uninterrupted. By evening, the city had swallowed the day whole. Neon returned. Music rose. The disappearance remained contained within offices and quiet conversations, invisible to the crowds outside. For the families, time fractured. Every passing hour without news felt louder than the last. What had been a missed pickup in the morning now stretched into something unrecognizable. The hope that this was a misunderstanding faded with each failed call, each dead end. The hotel rooms remained sealed again after inspection. Doors closed. Hallways returned to their neutral silence. Whatever answers existed did not announce themselves. They stayed hidden, buried beneath policy, procedure, and the city's relentless forward motion. Morning had come and gone, and with it, the certainty that the women would simply reappear. What remained was a growing, suffocating realization. Something had happened during the quietest hours of the night, and no one had been watching closely enough to see it. Las Vegas did what it always does. It moved on, and somewhere within its walls, 3 lives had already slipped beyond reach. By the time the families arrived in Las Vegas, the city already felt hostile, not because it was openly cruel, but because it was indifferent. They stepped into the same airport where their daughters and sisters had landed days earlier, carrying the same confusion, but none of the optimism. The Strip greeted them with noise and color that felt obscene against a quiet terror settling into their chests. Everywhere they looked, life was being celebrated. Somewhere within that celebration, 3 lives were missing. The search began without shape. Police briefings were vague, cautious, and frustratingly procedural. There were no suspects, no witnesses, no evidence of violence. The words repeated themselves in different arrangements, always circling the same emptiness. Investigators explained what they could not do more clearly than what they could. Adults were allowed to disappear. Without proof of crime, resources were limited. Time was already working against them. Families stayed in nearby hotels, sleeping poorly, waking often to the sound of elevators and distant laughter. Each morning brought a surge of fragile hope. Each night ended with exhaustion and disappointment. They walked the Strip handing out photos, their loved ones' faces clashing painfully with the fantasy imagery surrounding them. Some people stopped. Most didn't. Inside the hotel where the women were last seen, the search felt constrained. Staff were cooperative but guarded, answering questions with rehearsed politeness. Security logs were incomplete. Surveillance footage existed, but it was fragmented. Angles blocked, timestamps overlapping, moments missing entirely. Investigators watched hours of recordings that showed everything except what mattered. There were no images of the women leaving the hotel. This fact should have changed everything. Instead, it complicated it. Without footage showing them exiting, the possibility remained that they had left unseen, slipped through a side door, taken a service elevator, or walked out during a gap in recording. The hotel was large, its infrastructure complex. Certainty was impossible. As days passed, speculation filled the void where facts refused to settle. One theory suggested they had chosen to leave together. Maybe they'd gone out drinking. Maybe they'd met someone. Maybe they decided, impulsively, to disappear. These ideas were floated casually, sometimes even sympathetically, as if they offered comfort. Instead, they landed like accusations. They reframed absence as choice, mystery as recklessness. Families pushed back hard. This was not who they were. Flight attendants lived by schedules. They did not abandon flights, careers, or families without warning. The women had plans, responsibilities, futures. None of that mattered to a city accustomed to reinvention narratives. Another theory leaned on Las Vegas itself, its reputation for excess, its shadows, its appetite for secrets. But without evidence, even this felt abstract, too large to grasp. You cannot search a city that thrives on anonymity. Investigators knocked on doors, questioned staff, reviewed guest lists. Thousands of people had passed through the hotel that night. Most remembered nothing. Some remembered fragments, faces, laughter, movement, but nothing anchored, nothing usable. Memory dissolved quickly in a place designed to overwhelm the senses. As the investigation stalled, the tone shifted. Urgency gave way to routine. Leads were followed, then closed. Paperwork grew thicker. Updates became less frequent. The case slipped down priority lists, competing with fresher crimes, clearer violence, stories that demanded immediate resolution. For the families, this was unbearable. They organized their own searches. They retraced steps that might never have been taken. They visited nearby businesses, hospitals, shelters. They asked questions until their voices cracked. Every unanswered inquiry deepened the sense that they were alone in this fight. Media coverage was brief and uneven. Headlines appeared, then vanished. The story lacked the elements that sustained attention. No bodies, no suspect, no dramatic footage. It was too quiet, too unresolved. Viewers moved on. Behind closed doors, investigators debated possibilities they could not prove. Human trafficking, accidental death, covered up, internal involvement. Each theory required a leap, and without evidence, leaps were dangerous. No one wanted to be wrong. No one wanted to accuse without cause. Time continued to pass, and with it, opportunity eroded. Hotel staff rotated. Memories faded. Records were archived. Surveillance tapes were overwritten. The physical space remained, but its connection to the women weakened with every renovation, every repainting, every new carpet laid over old floors. Eventually, the case was no longer active. It was open but dormant, a distinction that offered little comfort. Files were boxed, leads marked exhausted. The search that had once consumed days and nights shrank to occasional reviews, quiet check-ins, a lingering question that no one seemed equipped to answer. For the families, there was no such closure. They returned home carrying a grief that had nowhere to land. No funerals, no confirmations, just a permanent suspension between hope and despair. Holidays became difficult. Ordinary moments felt wrong. Every phone call carried a flicker of expectation that refused to die. Las Vegas remained where it was, bright, thriving, unchanged. The hotel continued to welcome guests who slept soundly in rooms near where the women had last been accounted for. Life moved forward without acknowledging what it had taken. The search had gone nowhere, not because it lacked effort at the beginning, but because it lacked permission to dig deeper. Without a clear crime, without visible blood or broken doors, the disappearance was treated as an anomaly rather than an emergency. And in that hesitation, in that refusal to imagine the worst, the truth slipped further out of reach. What remained was a case defined not by what was found, but by what was missing. 3 women, and the certainty that someone, somewhere, knew exactly what had happened to them. As the years passed, the disappearance of the 3 flight attendants began to change shape. What had once been an active crisis hardened into a story, retold, simplified, and slowly detached from the people at its center. In Las Vegas, time does not preserve memory. It repackages it. The city is built to recycle narratives, to turn tragedy into trivia, mystery into entertainment. And so, quietly, the women were absorbed into the background noise. Within a year, their case was no longer discussed in daily briefings. Detectives were reassigned. New crimes demanded attention. The files remained, technically open, but untouched for long stretches. Each time someone revisited them, the same obstacles remained. No witnesses, no exit footage, no physical evidence. The case became a circle leading back to itself. Outside official channels, speculation flourished. Online forums and late-night radio shows began to mention the disappearance as part of Las Vegas lore. The details were rarely accurate. Names were misspelled. Timelines blurred. The women were sometimes described as reckless, sometimes as naive, sometimes as thrill-seekers who had wandered too far into the city's underbelly. Each retelling stripped away nuance, replacing it with whatever made the story easier to digest. The city encouraged this transformation. Vegas has always sold dangerous fantasy. What happens here becomes a punchline, a dare, a cautionary tale told with a wink. The disappearance was folded into that mythology, losing its weight with each retelling. It became less about 3 specific lives and more about the idea of vanishing itself. The hotel continued to operate as if nothing had happened. Management changed. Staff turned over. Policies were updated. Renovations refreshed spaces that had grown dated. New carpets muffled old footsteps. Walls were repainted, then repainted again. Entire sections of the building were reconfigured to meet evolving tastes. Each alteration distanced the present further from the night in 1996. New employees were rarely told about the case. There was no reason to. It was not part of their training. It did not affect their daily tasks. If they heard about it at all, it was as rumor, stripped of context and responsibility. The building learned how to forget by design. For the families, forgetting was impossible. They watched as public interest faded, replaced by newer tragedies with clearer endings. Each anniversary passed quietly. Sometimes a short article appeared. Sometimes nothing did. They learned how to live with a story that no longer belonged to the news cycle. Grief, without answers, has a way of turning inward. It reshapes relationships. It creates rifts where there were none, bonds where silence might have been easier. Some family members dedicated themselves to keeping the case alive, writing letters, making calls, asking questions long after they were expected to stop. Others withdrew, exhausted by the constant reopening of wounds. The women themselves became frozen in time. Photographs from the early 90s were reused again and again. Hair, fashion, expressions locked in an era that moved on without them. To the outside world, they never aged. To their families, that stasis was unbearable. Every year that passed without answers felt like a betrayal of reality. As technology advanced, new possibilities emerged. Databases expanded. Cold case units gained tools that hadn't existed before. Yet the fundamental problem remained unchanged. Without knowing where to look, technology could only illuminate the same dead ends more clearly. Occasionally, tips came in. A sighting reported in another state. A confession from someone seeking attention. Each lead raised hope briefly before collapsing under scrutiny. The emotional toll of these false starts was immense. Hope, once offered, is hard to take back. Las Vegas, meanwhile, continued to lean into its mythology. Tourists came seeking freedom, reinvention, escape. Few considered the cost of that promise. Fewer still questioned the spaces that enabled it. The idea that someone could disappear within a luxury hotel without consequence became part of the city's mystique rather than its indictment. This was perhaps the most painful transformation of all, the way the story was reframed from a failure of systems into a symbol of the city's allure. Danger became romance. Silence became intrigue. The truth was far less glamorous. It was built from indifference, compartmentalization, and the quiet prioritization of reputation over accountability. It lived in the spaces between departments, in the assumptions that someone else would notice, someone else would act. By the time nearly a decade had passed, the disappearance had become what officials politely called a cold case. The term suggested preservation, like something set aside carefully. In reality, it meant distance. It meant lowered expectations. It meant the slow acceptance that answers might never come. For the families, that acceptance was a lie they refused to tell themselves. They marked time not in years, but in absences. Weddings without sisters. Birthdays without calls. Empty chairs that never felt normal. The women were not ghosts to them. They were unfinished lives, suspended in a city that had moved on. Las Vegas still doesn't like to look back. It thrives on the idea that every night resets the board. But some stories resist that erasure. They linger beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to break through. For nearly 3 decades, this one stayed buried. Not because it was unsolvable, but because it was inconvenient. Because acknowledging it fully would have required the city to admit that its brightest spaces could also be its darkest. And so the story slept, tucked behind layers of myth and neglect, waiting for someone, to disturb the walls that kept it hidden. Time did not soften the disappearance. It stretched it. 28 years passed. And yet for families of the 3 women, the moment they stopped answering their phones never truly receded. It lived close to the surface, rising unexpectedly, shaping every major life event that followed. Grief usually moves through stages. This kind of grief did not. It remained suspended, unfinished, like a sentence that refused to end. Parents grew older carrying a question they never expected to outlive. Birthdays came and went, each one a reminder of what should have been marked together. Some kept rooms exactly as they were. Clothes untouched, photographs undisturbed, small details preserved in defiance of time. Others could not bear the stillness and packed everything away, not as an act of closure, but of survival. Siblings learned how absence changes identity. They became the ones who stayed, the ones who remembered, the ones who answered questions no one should have to answer. At family gatherings, the missing were spoken of carefully, as if saying too much might cause pain, and saying too little might feel like betrayal. Their names existed in a delicate balance between presence and silence. Children grew up hearing stories instead of voices. They learned what their mothers or aunts were like through photographs and secondhand memories. They imagined futures that never happened, graduations attended, advice given, holidays shared. For them, the disappearance was not a loss of something remembered, but the loss of something never fully known. The not knowing was its own kind of cruelty. Every year brought the possibility, however faint, that answers might finally come. A phone call, a letter, a break in the case. Each time nothing happened. Hope adjusted rather than disappeared. It learned to live smaller, quieter, but it never left entirely. Some family members became reluctant experts in investigative language. They learned the difference between inactive and close. They learned how to request records, how to follow up without becoming a nuisance, how to press without pushing so hard that doors close permanently. They learned patience they never asked for. Others turned inward. They avoided news stories about disappearances. They stopped watching crime shows. The subject became too close, too invasive. Grief, uncontained, had seeped into daily life, shaping decisions, relationships, even personalities. Las Vegas remained a distant presence in their lives, both a physical place and a symbol. Some refused to return, unwilling to walk streets that had swallowed their loved ones. Others went back again and again, drawn by the hope that proximity might somehow bring clarity. Each visit carried its own emotional cost. The hotel still stood. From the outside, it looked unchanged, renovated, modernized, rebranded perhaps, but fundamentally the same structure. For the families, it existed as a fixed point in time, a building that had outlived youth, outlived certainty, outlived justice. They wondered what it remembered, if walls could remember at all. As decades passed, society changed around the case. Conversations about corporate responsibility, institutional negligence, and victims' rights grew louder. Stories once dismissed gained new attention. Cold cases were reopened with fresh eyes. But the disappearance of 3 flight attendants lingered in a gray area, old enough to be forgotten, unresolved enough to remain painful. Occasionally, journalists reached out, anniversary pieces, retrospectives. Each request reopened wounds. Families faced the impossible choice between keeping the story alive and protecting themselves from reliving it. Some agreed to speak. Others declined. Both choices carried guilt. What never changed was the sense of being suspended between realities. Without confirmation of death, mourning felt incomplete. Without proof of life, hope felt irresponsible. The families existed in that space for nearly 3 decades, adapting to a world that demanded closure they did not have. They learned how to live with unanswered questions in practical ways. Legal documents required decisions, presumptions made reluctantly years after the fact. Belongings were distributed with hesitation. Lives moved forward unevenly, always dragging the past behind them. And yet love endured. The women were remembered not for how they disappeared, but for how they lived. Stories were told and retold, refining memory rather than erasing it. Laughter survived. Habits were recalled. Small quirks became cherished rather than painful. In these moments, the women felt close again, not as mysteries, but as people. Still, the question remained. What happened in that hotel? How could 3 women vanish without leaving a trace? Why had no one been held accountable? These questions did not fade with time. They sharpened. For nearly 28 years, the families existed in a state of waiting, not passive, but enduring. Waiting for truth. Waiting for acknowledgement. Waiting for something solid to replace the hollow uncertainty that had defined so much of their lives. They did not know that answers were closer than they had ever been. They did not know that the very place they had feared and fixated on, the building that had seemed so silent, was quietly preparing to give up what it had held for decades. Time, it turned out, had not erased the truth. It had only buried it deeper, waiting for the moment when the walls themselves could no longer hold it in. Renovations are supposed to be about renewal. Fresh paint, updated lighting, new carpets laid over the footprints of countless strangers. In Las Vegas, they happen constantly. Hotels reinvent themselves the way other cities change seasons. When this particular renovation was approved, it barely registered outside corporate meetings and construction schedules. Another upgrade, another attempt to stay modern in a city that punishes stagnation. No one thought it would matter. The plans were routine on the surface. A partial interior redesign. Some walls removed to open up space. Service corridors adjusted. Infrastructure updated to meet newer codes. The kind of work that happens quietly, floor by floor, while guests continue to sleep a few levels above. Management assured everyone it would be seamless. Disruption kept to a minimum. Business as usual. Construction crews arrived before dawn each day, moving through back entrances unseen by most guests. They wore no history on their faces, carried no knowledge of what the building had once been. To them, it was concrete, steel, wiring materials, not memories. They followed blueprints that had been revised and reissued multiple times over the decades, each version drifting slightly further from the original. At first, nothing felt unusual. Walls came down where they were supposed to. Old fixtures were removed. Dust filled the air and control bursts, vacuumed away before guests ever noticed. The work progressed methodically, predictably. Schedules were met. Checklists were cleared. Then someone noticed a discrepancy. It was small at first, a measurement that didn't align, a space that felt too narrow given what the plan suggested should be there. The kind of thing construction workers notice instinctively, even if they can't immediately explain why. A supervisor double-checked the drawings. Everything looked correct on paper, but the wall remained wrong. Behind it, the layout didn't match any documented design. It wasn't a supporting wall. It didn't serve an obvious purpose. It simply existed, sealed, uninterrupted, blending seamlessly into the structure as if it had always belonged there. No access panels, no utility lines, just solid material where empty space should have been. At first, the assumption was error. Older buildings carry quirks. Renovations over time can create oddities, sealed doorways, forgotten alcoves, abandoned shafts. The crew prepared to remove the wall as planned, expecting nothing more than an awkward void behind it. When they began to break through, the atmosphere shifted. The material was thicker than expected. Layers appeared where there should have been one. It took longer, required more effort. Tools echoed differently against it, producing a dull, resistant sound that felt wrong. The workers exchanged glances, the kind that communicate unease without words. Behind the wall, there was space. Not a crawl space, not a utility shaft. A contained area, sealed off deliberately. Air inside was stale, untouched. Dust lay undisturbed, thick enough to suggest years, decades of isolation. This was not accidental architecture. This was something intentionally hidden. Work stopped. Supervisors were called. Management was notified. Protocols were consulted. No one wanted to assume the worst, but no one could ignore the feeling that something had gone unacknowledged for a very long time. The building, it seemed, was holding on to something it had never released. As more of the wall was removed, details emerged that could not be explained away as structural oversight. This space had not been forgotten. It had been closed, purposefully, cleanly, as if someone had wanted it to disappear, without raising questions. The hotel responded carefully. Access was restricted, conversations lowered, decisions were escalated beyond on-site management. Legal teams became involved almost immediately, not because anyone yet knew what they were dealing with, but because uncertainty itself carried risk. For the workers who had first uncovered the space, the experience lingered. They had spent their careers inside buildings, tearing them apart and putting them back together. They understood the difference between neglect and concealment. This was the latter. When authorities were finally contacted, it was done with measured language. No speculation, no assumptions, just a report of an undocumented sealed area discovered during renovation. Standard procedure. Calm, controlled. But beneath that control, tension grew. Investigators arrived and began their work with the same restraint. Photographs, measurements, documentation. The methodical peeling back of decades-old decisions. The hotel staff watched from a distance, aware that something irreversible was unfolding. Word did not spread immediately. In a city built on spectacle, silence is often the first response to potential scandal. Information was contained, shared only on a need-to-know basis. The building remained open. Guests continued their stays, unaware that a buried chapter of the hotel's history was being reopened just feet away. For the families of the missing women, none of this was yet known. They were living their ordinary days, shaped by long-accustomed grief, unaware that the place that had haunted them for nearly 3 decades was finally cracking. The truth was not announced. It did not arrive with fanfare. It waited quietly behind a wall that should not have existed. As investigators worked, patterns began to form, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. The age of the materials, the timing of renovations that had sealed the space, the deliberate nature of concealment. Each detail narrowed the window of possibility. This was not recent. This had been done long ago. The building, renovated countless times, had protected its secret through layers of bureaucracy, ownership changes, and institutional forgetting. It had survived inspections, audits, upgrades, all without revealing what it held. Not because it was clever, but because no one had thought to look. Renovation, meant to modernize, had instead disturbed something that had been waiting patiently. When the realization finally settled that this discovery could be connected to a disappearance that had haunted families for decades, the weight of it was immediate and profound. The past was no longer abstract. It had coordinates. It had dimensions. It had been occupying physical space all along. The wall, once just part of the hotel, became a threshold. And beyond it, the truth was no longer content to stay hidden. When the space behind the wall was fully opened, there was no dramatic moment, no sudden rush of sound or movement. Instead, there was a heavy stillness, the kind that presses inward, demanding silence. Investigators stepped carefully, aware that whatever they were entering had been sealed off not just physically, but historically. This was not a forgotten corner. It was a decision made solid. The air inside was old, not foul, not shocking, just untouched. Decades had passed without circulation, without interruption. Dust lay thick on every surface, undisturbed by footsteps or airflow. It told a story of time that had stopped abruptly and never restarted. Lights were brought in slowly, illuminating a space that had never been meant to be seen again. What mattered most was not any single object, but the fact of the space itself, its size, its placement, its deliberate isolation from the rest of the building. This was not an architectural accident. It was not a construction oversight. It was a room that had been erased from blueprints, sealed in a way that required intention, coordination, and silence. Someone had decided this space should not exist, and had succeeded for nearly 30 years. As documentation began, investigators noted details that connected the space to the night in 1996. The materials used to seal aligned with renovation records from that period. The methods matched practices common at the time, not later decades. This immediately narrowed the window of possibility. Whoever closed the space had done so shortly after it became necessary. The realization settled slowly and painfully. This was not a place where something had wandered into by accident. This was a place something had been put. Evidence was handled with restraint. Nothing was rushed. Every movement was measured. Every discovery recorded without spectacle. The absence of chaos made the truth heavier, not lighter. There was no violence frozen in time, no dramatic tableau. There was only the quiet confirmation that the women had never left the hotel. The question of how shifted quickly to why. Why go to such lengths? Why hide instead of remove? Why trust that silence would hold? The answers pointed not to impulse, but to calculation, to a belief that containment was safer than exposure, that the building itself could be used as a shield. That time would do the rest. Investigators began reconstructing the chain of decisions that must have followed the disappearance. The first realization that something had gone terribly wrong. The fear of consequences. The understanding that involving authorities would bring scrutiny not just on individuals, but on the institution itself. In a city where image is currency, scandal is fatal. This was not framed as a single villain acting alone. It was something more disturbing than that. It was cooperation, omission, agreement without documentation. The kind of silence that spreads because each participant believes someone else will eventually speak. But no one did. The women were not erased by violence alone. They were erased by systems that prioritize continuity over conscience, by procedures designed to smooth disruption, not confront it, by the assumption that if enough time passed, the story would lose its power. For the families, when they were finally contacted, the news did not arrive as closure. It arrived as confirmation of a truth they had carried intuitively for decades. Grief returned, but it was different now, sharper, anchored. The endless loop of wondering was replaced by a single, devastating certainty. They had been there all along. The hotel they had feared, the place they had questioned, the building that had loomed in the background of every unanswered year. It had never let their loved ones leave. The realization was almost unbearable in its simplicity. Public response followed in waves. Shock came first, then anger, then a reckoning that extended beyond the individuals involved. Questions were asked not just about who did this, but how it had been allowed to remain hidden for so long. How many inspections had missed it? How many renovations had passed over it? How many people had unknowingly slept above it? The hotel issued statements measured in language and heavy with legal caution. Words like deeply concerning and fully cooperating appeared, but they rang hollow against the weight of what had been uncovered. No statement could undo decades of silence. What haunted investigators most was not what they found, but what they didn't. No warnings, no records, no anonymous tips that led here sooner. Just a void where accountability should have been. It forced a reconsideration of how many other truths might be buried not by secrecy alone, but by collective convenience. The women, once reduced to a mystery, began to reemerge as individuals in the public consciousness. Their names were spoken again, this time with gravity rather than speculation. Stories resurfaced, not about how they vanished, but about who they had been before that night. Still, the space behind the wall remained the center of it all. It stood as proof that some truths do not disappear. They wait. They settle into the structure of the world, becoming part of it, until something disrupts the balance enough to force them out. In this case, it wasn't justice that broke the silence first. It was renovation, a routine act, a desire to modernize, an assumption that the past had nothing left to say. Behind that wall was not just evidence of a crime. It was evidence of a choice, a decision to trust walls more than people, silence more than responsibility, time more than truth. And once exposed, it became impossible to pretend that the city hadn't known how to forget. Once the truth was exposed, the question that followed was unavoidable. Not what happened. That much was finally, painfully clear, but how it had been allowed to remain hidden for so long. 28 years is not a failure of chance. It is a failure of systems, sustained by choices that favor stability over scrutiny. The investigation widened, not outward into the city, but inward, into policies, protocols, and quiet agreements that shape how institutions protect themselves. The focus shifted from individual actions to structural ones, from moments of violence to decades of silence. Hotels like this one do not operate on improvisation. Everything is governed by procedure. Renovations require approvals. Alterations are documented. Inspections are routine. For a sealed space to remain undiscovered across multiple ownership changes and regulatory reviews, something more than oversight had to be at play. Investigators began tracing timelines alongside corporate records. Renovation schedules were cross-referenced with the disappearance. Management transitions were examined. Who was in charge when the space was sealed? Who signed off on the changes? Who benefited from not asking questions? What emerged was not a single cover-up, but a layered one. The first layer was fear. In the immediate aftermath of the disappearance, the hotel faced a potential catastrophe. 3 airline employees vanishing within its walls was not just a tragedy. It was a threat to reputation, contracts, and revenue. Las Vegas thrives on confidence. Anything that undermines perception of safety risks everything. The second layer was bureaucracy. Decisions were compartmentalized. One department handled renovations. Another handled security. Another handled public relations. Information did not flow freely between them. This fragmentation allowed responsibility to dissolve. No single person held the full picture. No single person felt obligated to speak. The third layer was time. As days became weeks and weeks became years, urgency faded. Staff changed. Memories blurred. What may have started as a conscious decision not to escalate became an inherited silence. New managers accepted the building as it was handed to them, trusting that anything important would already have been addressed. This is how institutions bury truths, not always with malice, but with momentum. There was also the unspoken calculus of cost. Acknowledging what had happened would have triggered lawsuits, criminal investigations, and public outrage. It would have forced scrutiny not just of the hotel, but of the city's broader approach to safety and accountability. Silence was cheaper. Silence was safer. Regulatory bodies were not spared from scrutiny either. Inspections, it turned out, were designed to ensure compliance with safety codes, not uncover hidden spaces. Inspectors checked what was documented. They did not search for what had been deliberately erased from plans. Trust was embedded in the process. Trust that what wasn't listed didn't exist. That trust had been exploited. As the story became public, so did the discomfort. Questions were asked in hearings and press conferences, but answers came slowly, cautiously. Each institution distanced itself just enough to avoid direct blame. Language softened responsibility. Words like oversight, gap, and unfortunate failure replaced more direct acknowledgments. For the families, this was a second betrayal. They had already endured decades of not knowing. Now they were forced to confront a reality that knowing had been possible much sooner, that the truth had been physically present, contained within walls that people walked past every day. The pain was not just in what had happened, but in how preventable the silence had been. Anger replaced sorrow in waves. Not the loud, explosive kind, but a focused, burning clarity. The realization that their loved ones had not simply been lost to fate, but to convenience. That the city had made a calculation, even if indirectly, and decided that exposure was worse than disappearance. Legal actions followed, measured and deliberate. They were not driven by vengeance, but by a need for acknowledgement. Accountability was no longer abstract. It had names, dates, signatures. Still, consequences unfolded unevenly. Some responsible parties were long retired. Others had passed away. Time had done its work, not just on memory, but on liability. Justice, delayed this long, could never be complete. It could only be partial, symbolic, yet symbols mattered. Public trust in institutions relies on the belief that truth, once uncovered, will be confronted honestly. This case shattered that belief for many. It revealed how easily systems could prioritize continuity over conscience, how silence could be mistaken for neutrality. The hotel itself became a symbol, not just of what happened, but of what was allowed to persist. Guests canceled reservations. Public opinion shifted. The building's polished exterior could no longer hide its past. Every renovation after that discovery carried a new weight. Every wall invited suspicion. What haunted investigators most was not the singularity of this case, but its implications. If something like this could remain hidden in one of the most surveilled, regulated environments in the country, what else had been buried elsewhere? What other truths were sealed behind paperwork and procedure? This was no longer just a story about three women. It was a story about how easily people can be lost when systems are designed to protect themselves first. The families, despite everything, did not ask for spectacle. They asked for honesty, for records released without obstruction, for acknowledgments that did not hide behind legal language, for the simple, devastating admission that their loved ones mattered less than reputation. That admission, when it finally came, was quiet. It did not undo the years. It did not restore what was taken, but it shifted the narrative. The women were no longer framed as a mystery that vanished into the night. They were victims of a series of choices, made by people, upheld by systems, and sustained by silence. And once that silence broke, it became impossible to pretend that time alone had been responsible for hiding the truth. It had been allowed to stay hidden. On purpose. Las Vegas did not change after the truth came out. That was the most unsettling part. The light still came on at dusk, flickering to life as if nothing had happened. Music still poured out of open doors. Tourists still arrived with expectations carefully shaped by advertisements and myth. The city absorbed the revelation the way it absorbs everything else. Quickly, efficiently, without letting it disrupt the rhythm that keeps it alive. For a brief moment, there was discomfort. News cycles turned. Headlines sharpened. Commentators spoke about accountability, about institutional failure, about how something like this could happen in plain sight. And then, slowly, the city exhaled. Another story moved into focus. Another spectacle demanded attention. But for the families, the ending did not arrive with the discovery. It arrived later in fragments, in moments when the noise died down and reality settled into its final shape. There was no version of closure that felt complete. They had answers now, but answers are not the same as peace. Knowing where their loved ones had been all those years did not soften the loss. It sharpened it. The truth came with images they could not unsee, with questions that no longer needed asking but still refused to go away. Why this way? Why this long? Why silence instead of help? Some families returned to Las Vegas one last time. They walked past the hotel not as investigators or petitioners, but as witnesses. The building looked ordinary in daylight, stripped of glamour, its size almost underwhelming without the glow of night. Cars passed. People laughed. Life continued around them without pause. Standing there, they felt the weight of contrast more than ever. A place that had meant everything to them meant almost nothing to anyone else. They did not go inside. Others chose not to come back at all. The city had taken enough. For them, Las Vegas will remain a distant outline on the horizon of their lives, a place associated not with excess or escape, but with unanswered phone calls and years of waiting. Memorials were discussed, debated, sometimes abandoned. How do you mark a loss that was denied space for decades? How do you honor lives that were hidden instead of mourned? Any gesture felt insufficient, yet doing nothing felt wrong. Eventually, remembrance took quieter forms. Stories were shared among family members without restraint now. The women were spoken of freely, not as missing, not as mysteries, but as people whose lives had waited long before they disappeared. Laughter returned to those conversations, not as denial, but as reclamation. The city had taken their bodies, but it had not taken their identities. Publicly, the hotel tried to move forward. Statements were issued. Policies were reviewed. Training programs were announced. All the correct words were used. But trust, once broken at the scale, does not return easily. Every reassurance carried the echo of what had been hidden. Every promise felt provisional. Guests still stayed there. Many never learned the full story. Others did and chose not to think about it. Comfort has a way of dulling curiosity. People are skilled at accepting safety when it is presented convincingly enough. That, perhaps, was the most haunting realization of all. The system that allowed 3 women to disappear did not rely on cruelty alone. It relied on normalcy, on the human tendency to assume that what is comfortable is also benign, that what looks stable must be safe. The case forced a question that reached beyond one hotel, one city, one moment in time. How many stories remain sealed because uncovering them would be inconvenient? How many truths are hidden not behind malice, but behind indifference, bureaucracy, and a belief that someone else will handle it? Las Vegas likes to tell people that what happens there stays there. It sells that promise as freedom, as permission. But some things stay not because they should, but because no one is willing to carry them back into the light. The disappearance of the 3 flight attendants was never just about a crime. It was about erasure, about how easily people can be reduced to anomalies when their absence does not disrupt profit or routine, about how silence, when rewarded, becomes policy. In the end, the truth did come out, but not because the system corrected itself, not because justice was prioritized. It came out because of chance, because of renovation schedules and misaligned blueprints, because a wall existed where it shouldn't have. That detail lingered with everyone involved. Justice did not break the silence. Time did not weaken it. Human courage did not dismantle it. A wall failed, and when it did, it revealed not just what had been hidden, but how fragile the illusion of safety truly is. For the families, life moved forward in altered form. It had to. They carried their loss differently now. Less as an open wound, more as a scar that still ached in certain weather. The story no longer lived in speculation. It lived in fact. That mattered. The women were no longer figures swallowed by myth. They were acknowledged, officially, as victims of something preventable, something allowed. Their names were no longer footnotes to the city's legend, but markers of its failure. At night, the Strip still glows. From a distance, it looks eternal, untouchable, immune to consequence. But beneath that light are layers of decisions, choices made and unmade, truths confronted and deferred. The city does not collapse under the weight of what it hides. It builds over it. And sometimes years later, the past pushes back. Not loudly, not violently, just enough to remind us that no place, no matter how bright, is beyond the reach of its own silence. In the years that followed, the story settled into its final form, not as a headline, not as a spectacle, but as a quiet warning. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't demand attention, but lingers in the background of places designed to distract. The city continued to promise escape, and people continue to believe it. Most never thought about what escape costs. The families learned how to live with an ending that arrived too late to feel like justice. There were no restored years, no rewritten futures, only acknowledgement, only truth. And even that came with limits. Some questions would never be answered fully. Some names would never be spoken publicly. Silence, once entrenched, does not dissolve all at once. What changed most was the way absence was understood. For decades, the women had been defined by what could not be found. Now, they were defined by what had been hidden. Their story became less about disappearance and more about containment, about how easy it is to seal something away when enough people agree not to look too closely. The hotel eventually rebranded. New signage went up. Interiors were redesigned again, brighter, cleaner, more modern. To a first-time visitor, there was nothing to suggest the building had ever held a secret. That was the point. Reinvention is how Las Vegas survives. But buildings remember, even when people choose not to. The space behind the wall no longer existed in the same way. It had been documented, dismantled, absorbed back into the structure. On blueprints, it was gone again. But memory does not follow architectural rules. What was once hidden could not be made invisible a second time. Occasionally, someone would ask if this discovery changed everything. It didn't. It changed something quieter and more unsettling. It changed the certainty people had in the systems meant to protect them. It challenged the assumption that safety is guaranteed simply because it is advertised. It reminded anyone willing to listen that silence often wears the mask of normalcy. For the families, remembrance became intentional. They marked anniversaries not of disappearance, but of life. They spoke names aloud. They refused to let the women be remembered only for how their story ended. That, in the end, was an act of resistance. The city never apologized in a way that felt complete. Cities rarely do. Responsibility is too diffuse, guilt too abstract. And yet, the truth existed now, immovable. Anyone who wanted to know could know. Most didn't. That may be the most honest ending the story can offer. Not redemption, not full accountability, just exposure. A brief moment when the wall came down and everyone had the chance to look inside. Some did. Some turned away. Las Vegas still shines at night, brighter than the desert that surrounds it. From above, it looks like a promise, order carved into darkness. But promises depend on what they exclude. And sometimes what they exclude waits patiently, hidden in plain sight, until chance decides it's time. The women did not vanish into the city. They were kept, and the truth about them survived not because it was protected, but because it was buried imperfectly. Because even the most carefully constructed silence has weak points. Because walls eventually are torn down. That is what remains. Not just a story about 3 lives lost, but about how easily the world can keep moving while something unforgivable stays sealed behind familiar surfaces. And how, every once in a while, the past insists on being seen, whether anyone is ready for it or not.